Hello, friends. Greg Koukl here. Stand to Reason is the show, and this hour we are spending the entire time with a friend that, now I'm thinking about it, it's probably been years since I've had on the show. Justin Taylor, formerly with John Piper and Desiring God, and actually that's been a few years now, Vice President of Book Publishing and Associate Publisher at Crossway. Big title there, Justin. Glad to have you on board.
Thanks, Greg. Great to talk to you.
You know, we bumped into each other at ETS in November, and it was just a passing in the night almost. It was. I always get frustrated when I see friends like yourself so infrequently, and then I'm not able to sit down and have a meal or, and just enjoy some jawing together. We have done that in the past. We weren't able to do it last time. By the way, there was a moment, and you probably don't remember this, but I passed you on the street there in Baltimore, and I said hi to you, and you whirled around like, who was that? But I was wearing a black baseball cap, and I'm sure you did not recognize me, and you were wondering who was stalking you or whatever. I don't know.
No. Yeah, sometimes it takes me a second for my mind to catch up, so I probably recognized you, and sorry if you felt slighted.
No, I didn't at all. I was moving on. I was on a man with a mission, so I couldn't. I wasn't able to slow down. Anyway, good to have you on board.
Thank you.
We have an hour to talk together a little bit. Most of you will be familiar with Justin Taylor, also known as JT, because of his must-read blog at the Gospel Coalition. It's called Between Two Worlds. Justin, why don't you just give a pitch for your blog there? It is. I know the Enforcer, Melinda, and many others make a daily stop there to see what you're thinking about. Tell us about Between Two Worlds.
Yeah, I've run it for, I think it's going on 10 years now, and it's sort of just, for me, a filing system of things that I find interesting and that I find edifying, and try to blog every day, at least once a day, sometimes multiple times a day. And it's sort of what hits my fancy about things that I want to point people to. There's a certain point in my life and ministry when I realized I'm not the world's best at producing content, but I can point to good content. So great things coming out of STR and great sermons or great books. I like to try to point people to them. So Gospel Coalition has hosted it for the past several years, and I enjoy it, and hope people find it helpful.
So if people just Google Between Two Worlds, they'd find you are Justin Taylor, JustinTaylor. I mean, simple, just as it sounds. That would be the best way to get that, right?
Sure, or go to thegospelcoalition.org.
I thought it was interesting the way you put it, that you're not necessarily the one who originates all of the content, but you broker the content quite well. And as I'm recalling now some of the books that you've been involved with in the past, and they've been books that you have been maybe a principal editor of, where you're drawing from different sources, you're putting the right people together and putting together a good volume, and that's your contribution.
Yeah, it's some of us have the gift, I think, of pointing. That's the primary way that the Lord has designed us to point to other people, and so I think that fits with my editorial role and editorial gifting.
At Crossway,
blogging, right?
Yeah. By the way, you pointed me to something really fine about 3 years ago when we were in San Francisco at ETS. And I have been recommending it ever since. In fact, it's part of I have like 6 books packet that I recommend every Christmas. It's like one on apologetics, one's on theology, one on Christian living, and blah, blah, blah. The tactics, of course, is in there. But that sounds a little self-serving. But it's the book, The Enemy Within.
Mm-hmm. A funny story. You probably don't know this, Greg, but the first time I ever saw that book, it had just been published by P&R, and I picked it up at ETS. This was probably back in 1998, 1999, and I was in the hotel lobby, and I sat down and started reading it, and you and Mike Horton were standing about 10 feet from me, and you
Is
guys
that-
talked for about an hour, I think. But I read that book straight through, cover to cover, and didn't go to bed till I finished it, which
Oh,
is
my goodness.
pretty rare for me. But
Yeah.
so
Well,
you were there when I discovered the book, and
oh,
then
no kidding.
I got to give it along to you.
That's a great story. I actually had Mike Horton on the air
Yeah.
last week because he's done a nice work on a kind of a not exactly devotional, but it's about the Christian life from John Calvin. So it's about
Yeah.
Calvin's view on Christian living.
I edited that book.
Oh,
Crossway
that's right.
Publishing
It is a Crossway book, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, good. Well, so I'm not telling you anything new there. It is an excellent book. We had a great conversation,
Okay.
and that book, that other one, is a fabulous book. I still draw from it, and because it has to. You know what I like about that? And I'm sorry, we want to talk about the final days of Jesus, but
No, that's fine.
one comment about this other book is that I mean it's an analysis of John Owen's writing. Basically, it's a summation of John Owen, right?
Mhm.
And you're a fan of John Owen. I think you have a website, johnowen.org.
Mhm.
The reality of the struggle that Christians go through their entire life to live a godly life, a struggle with the flesh. And one of the most satisfying things about the book was just the realization that get ready to fight your whole life against this.
Yep.
And instead of that being depressing, that was a little bit liberating.
Mm.
You know, it's get in the harness, put up your dukes, and you're going to go until the bell rings, the final round, you know. And that was a great encouragement to me. In any event, that's not the book we want to talk about. The new book is The Final Days of Jesus, subtitled here, The Most Important Week of the Most Important Person Who Ever Lived. You wrote it with Andreas Kostenberger, and at least his name is familiar to me because we've had Michael Kruger, one of his co-authors, on. Were their books together, Crossway Books as well?
Yep, they were.
Okay, well, you guys are doing great work there at Crossway. I'm going to knock at your door here someday. And this one is about the final days of Jesus, and it's. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why this particular book? You were helping in the writing and the arranging of it. Tell us a little bit about why this book.
Yeah, it started, Greg, a few years ago, and I put onto my blog during Easter week. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you did kind of a day-by-day account as each day comes along? So on Palm Sunday, I did a blog post, what happened on Palm Sunday, and I included all of the ESV Bible text that pertained to Palm Sunday. So you could read through all four gospel accounts, see everything kind of laid out there together. You could compare the four accounts in the Gospels. And I just did that for each day. Then what happened on Monday, what happened on Tuesday, leading all the way up to Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And a number of people started using that during Holy Week. They'd read through it day by day, and one friend even suggested, you should think about turning this into a book. And so I contacted Dr. Kostenberger and asked if he might be interested in partnering with me on it. He's written a very well-known and well-received commentary on the Gospel of John. He's written an introduction to the New Testament, written a hermeneutics textbook. So I knew he'd be able to bring the scholarly weight to it. And yet I didn't want to make it a scholarly book with lots of technical terms and lots of footnotes. We wanted it to be something that was accessible for everyone from scholars to family and small groups, but well-informed by the best of evangelical scholarship.
Well, I think you accomplished that end, Justin. In fact,
Thanks.
were you the wordsmith for this? Because it reads very easily. It is very relaxed in its style. You have detail that relate to the academics of it, but it's not just as you said, it's not academically written. Was your role principally in the wordsmithing of it, in addition to the kind of the blow by blow through the week?
Yeah, I really set up the framework for it and did the glossary and the kind of the maps and charts. But Dr. Kostenberger really did the primary writing of the commentary, and I give some editorial feedback, but I think we both went into it knowing we're not writing for fellow scholars first and foremost.
Right.
We're trying to put it on the ground level and to tell the story as much as you can to make the reader feel like they're actually there, like they're standing there in the cool breeze of spring in AD 33.
Mm-hmm.
And what would that have been like as you're walking through each day of Jesus' final earthly week?
Well, I have to tip my hat to him because he has a light hand here. It's really nice, and it's very easy to read. And it is broken down day by day, just like you had done in the past. And you have the texts that are relevant, but you also have sections of commentary, and also you have, where appropriate, illustrations. I'm looking right now at the seating arrangements at the Last Supper, and people think of the Last Supper like Michelangelo, or was it Da Vinci? I get them mixed up, but it's like they're all sitting on one side like that, and
all in a row.
Yeah, all in a row, looking at the big screen TV on the opposites.
Right.
Yeah, just not like that. I actually have I'm not sure if you're prepared to answer. I think you probably would be. I have a lot of questions just about those days and some of the things that happened. And maybe we'll just run through some of these, and you can give me some of the thoughts that you have about them. The one is that you cite right at the beginning, you give Passion Week was culminated on the day of Crucifixion on the Friday, which was April 3rd, 30 A.D. Of course, the resurrection is 2 days later. You talk about that, of course, but this is the event on Golgotha, and you have a date. 30 A.D., April 3rd. I have two questions about that. I know that there are two different dates, 30 and 33, and you do mention in the text that 33 is one that more scholars kind of go with, but you had particular reasons with going with 30 A.D. I'm curious what those were.
Yeah, we actually, we're somewhat in the minority. We think it's 33, where I think the majority would say that it was in 30.
Okay. I got it mixed up there, but good. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem. And we've actually done an article that is going to go on the First Things blog sometime during Lent season, where we lay out all of the reasons. In particular, we think it's 33. But in short, it's the most helpful time marker in the text. There's nowhere where, of course they weren't counting years like 28, 29, 30 at that point. But Luke says
it's like finding the coin. The archaeologist found the coin that said 10 BC,
Exactly.
Wait a minute.
So Luke in particular gives us some time markers where he says that John the Baptist comes on the scene in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, the emperor at the time. And you think, okay, that's going to give us an exact date, but, when did they start those reigns and that sort of thing? So, but more likely than not, he started in mid-AD 14, so that puts John the Baptist ministry like 28 or 29 AD. And then Jesus comes on the scene in terms of his public ministry shortly thereafter, maybe a few months after that. So then it becomes a question of how long was Jesus' earthly ministry. And there are at least 3 Passovers that take place. Of course, the Passover is just once a year, maybe 4 Passovers. So we think that his ministry was 3 years in length. So if he comes on at the end of, in terms of his own baptism, end of 29 or 30, because of astronomy and how everything works, 30 and 33 are really the only 2 live options. So we just don't think there's enough time for a 3-year ministry to take place if Jesus was crucified in 30.
Well, you said astronomy. What astronomical features play into this dating?
The reports of a darkening of the sky, of an eclipse on that Good Friday. So you have to have it land on Passover, and so that Passover hits on a certain Friday.
How'd you get April 3rd?
That has to do with Passover, and then it has to be, on that Friday through Sunday. So where was that taking place when Passover would have been celebrated in 33. That's where it ends up. And we try to show in the book, of course, they weren't using months like April. So the Jewish month was Nisan, and that kind of overlaps from March into April. So one of the things we tried to do with the book is put in there little charts. I'm more visually oriented probably than other people, but just laying out a chart. Okay, here's the days in modern nomenclature, like April 1st, 33. But then here was the Jewish month of Nisan. Here was the day of the week. It all gets a little complicated because they didn't consider their days, from in the same
midnight
sort of 20,
to midnight.
Yeah, so sundown to, is the start of the next day. So try to lay that all out so that people can see it at a glance. Because these are the sort of things that when you walk away from this sort of thing, you get a little bit confused and the details get a little bit muddy.
Well, it's like 3 days and 3 nights, and that a lot of that you figure, wait, Friday night to Sunday morning. Wait, what's wrong with this picture? But it has to do with a different way of reckoning time.
Yeah.
What is something you are aware of about the Passion Week that either you missed before you did this analysis, or maybe you think that other people miss because they haven't looked at it the same way that you look? Was there any kind of surprises that jumped out at you as you laid this out? I just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg. And for me, I the best analogy I could give is that my own experience in this project was sort of like going from a black and white television program that's coming in a little bit sketchy to seeing it in a more high definition, full color version. It's the same characters, it's the same order, so there's no kind of major surprises like, hey, Jesus was actually crucified on Tuesday and not on Friday. But certain things come out in relief, and it seemed to me again and again, the closer you read, the more you read the text, the more you see things that you've never seen before. So, for example, I always just assumed that Jesus was crucified on the cross. He's got the insurrectionist or thief or robber on one side and the same on the other side. And one guy is sort of a mild guy and one guy is an angry guy. You read the text more carefully.
That's in the movie.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But you read it again, and one of the gospel accounts says that both of the men were mocking him.
Right.
So, here they are dying. It's very difficult to breathe in the way they're being crucified, and they're using their dying breath, both of them, to mock and to hurl insults at this man who ultimately is the God-man who created them. So both of them began by insulting him, and then one is changed and the other isn't. That was just a little detail that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
Or reading through the account in Gospel of John where Thomas is coming and he's doubting the resurrection. And I'd never seen this before, but you flip back just a few chapters and John specifically put John 11. Yeah. He puts Thomas there, that Thomas witnessed Lazarus being resuscitated from the dead. So he'd seen that, but and still his doubts were that strong that he needed to go to Jesus.
Yeah, something else I recall from, wasn't Thomas the one? Jesus delays, this is in John 11, he delays for a while, it appears on purpose so that Lazarus dies so he can raise him from the dead. But then he says, okay, well, Lazarus now is dead, says plainly. And then isn't it Thomas who says, okay, well, then we're going to go there and we'll die with him, or something morbid like that? And, it's like, Thomas, you are a dreary sounding guy. All right, Jesus, we'll all go die now. I don't know. Anyway, I'm talking with Justin Taylor here about the final days of Jesus, the most important week of the most important person who ever lived. We will be back in just a moment. We'll cover some more ground with him. I'm Greg Koukl. Stay with us on Stand to Reason.
At Stand to Reason, we depend on the support of donors to carry on our mission to equip Christian ambassadors, and your non-cash donation items can help. You can transform your old cars, cell phones, or other items into ministry impact by donating them to Stand to Reason. Think of it. Because of your donation, Christians just like you will be able to effectively share their faith and change the lives of others forever. To make non-cash donations of all kinds to Stand to Reason, call iDonate at 877-897-4273 or go to idonate.com and visit STR's page. They'll take care of everything for you and Stand to Reason. Just call them at 877-897-4273 or visit idonate.com. Thank you very much for making Stand to Reason's work possible.
Would you like brief, easily digestible answers to some of the challenges you face as a Christian ambassador? Well, that's why we created our Ambassador's Guide series of booklets. Each volume in this series is designed to equip you with the practical tools you need to understand a topic or area of concern confronting Christians today. With these booklets, you'll receive concise and approachable guides to various philosophies like pluralism and postmodernism, world religions such as Islam and Mormonism, even strategies on how to answer the challenges of the new atheists. To order a booklet from the Ambassador's Guide series, visit our online store at str.org or call 800-2-REASON.
Greg Koukl here, Stand to Reason, and my guest for our final hour together, Justin Taylor. And many of you know him from Between Two Worlds, his daily blog, or mostly daily, huh? And Vice President of Book Publishing. I didn't know you had such an august title over there at Crossway, but good for you. You guys are doing fabulous work.
Oh, thanks. They let us pick our own titles.
Is that right? Yeah, I'm president. I got to choose my own title, too, so it was kind of convenient. But I'd asked you the question about things that stood out for you. I'll tell you, when I was looking through it, and we'll get a little bit more detail in a few moments, but I was really taken with the amount of detail there was in the conversations Jesus had, or the back and forth with Pilate. I want to get to that in a few minutes, but there it is actually quite a detailed bit of narrative there, and I think most people think, yeah, Pilate's the bad guy, and he washed his hands and had Jesus flogged and then gave him over to the people, and that was it, but there was a lot more going on than that. And in just a few moments, I'll ask you about that, but I want to kind of build a little bit here. Let's see. When you have the way you've done it day by day, and you have the accounts kind of in parallel, that is, you'll have Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, or the verses that are appropriate for that section of time that you're dealing with, you run into a liability of people seeing the differences between the Gospels. And sometimes that adds texture, but sometimes it raises questions. And for example, you have the epitaph on Jesus' cross there, the certificate of debt, and there are 4 different ways of rendering it in each of the 4 Gospels. So, and you use that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the differences. Tell us what you said about that.
Yeah, I think as evangelicals, we don't want to hide that sort of thing. We want to face it squarely and ask if it actually can help us understand what's going on more deeply and more accurately. So with the example you just mentioned, Greg, all 4 accounts, and the worst possible way of putting it is that all 4 disagree with each other. I think more accurately, none of the 4 precisely line up exactly. And in fact, none of the 4 might represent the very exact wording. So John has Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Matthew has, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Mark just has the King of the Jews. And then Luke says, this is the King of the Jews. So it's 4 different ways. But we put a little chart in there where we sort of lined up all of the words. And you can see that really it's just a couple of them are leaving words out. And I think that's an instructive thing for us as we approach the text. One of the things that we're trying to model here and encourage readers of the Gospels is not to approach the text with suspicion, as if it's guilty until we prove it innocent, but rather to come with a humble, trusting heart, to come as one who is teachable, wanting to learn, and not to anachronistically impose false standards upon the text, where we're insisting that it do a certain level of precision, or it's not true. In every other case of life, if you were to look at these 4 different accounts, if you had 4 different people tell you what a sign said, it's obvious that this is all one message. They're just being selective and highlighting different aspects for it.
Yeah, let me offer kind of a reinforcement to what you said too, because I don't think I don't want people to hear what I don't think you're saying, and that is we just have to be charitable and trust and have faith kind of thing, but rather not as a Christian, well, we're just going to read it and not look at the difference. We're just going to believe the best about it. But you mean not as a Christian, but as a reader, give it the same kind of charitable reading that we would give any other accounting where you have different people reporting the same thing, and especially in an ancient document where, and this was your point about anachronistically imposing, that is the requirements of journalism for today, imposing them on them when they didn't follow the same rules. They didn't see the need for that. We're just looking at this like an ancient document, and we're just letting the people speak and sum up. And with that point of view, I think there is no material difference between these. It's all the King of the Jews, and in fact, it might have been, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.
Exactly.
And each one is simply dropped a couple of words out, of that. So there is a way to harmonize that without any trouble. But even if it weren't, you're saying the point isn't that we have to have photographic kind of representations, because that wasn't what they were trying to do to begin with.
Yep, that's well stated and exactly right. I agree with that entirely. In fact, we sometimes don't think about this, but I
wish my kids would say that more often. I don't.
I'll encourage them, if they're listening, to say it to you. But we sometimes don't think about the sort of converse of that. If we did have photographic precision, in other words, if you looked at all 4 accounts of the crucifixion epitaph and it had the exact same wording, if there was never any selectivity among the witnesses and everything just lined up exactly perfectly, I think then we'd have perhaps even a bigger problem, the same sort of problem that you would have in a courtroom if you had multiple witnesses telling the exact same story without any sort of deviation, without any texture, without any selectivity.
Sounds like collusion.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the variety and the nuances, ultimately telling the same story but in 4 complementary ways, I think that actually reinforces the authenticity of the historical narrative.
Yeah. Well, does that? My next question has to do with why 4 accounts. That is, what is the value of having 4 separate accounts? It sounds like you touched on it a little bit there. We have 4 different perspectives. We have truly independent witnesses, but there's more going on thematically that you talk about. Can you say something about that?
Sure. Yeah, I've actually wondered, why didn't God inspire the gospel like the final days of Jesus, what we produce?
Yeah.
Chronological format, put the dates in there. Let's just tell it as one continuous story. And for reasons of his own, he didn't do that. But I think when you have these 4 gospel writers, they're 4 different men. They have different circumstances. Luke is a Gentile, and the others are Jews. 2 of them are direct eyewitnesses. Luke talked about how he went and interviewed the eyewitnesses, kind of did an investigative report, and Mark was very close to Peter, who was obviously in the inner circle. But they're writing for different audiences.
Incidentally, could I jump just for
a
second?
Can, yeah.
Mark, I don't even know if I don't remember seeing this, but I didn't read every single word here, but there is in the Gospel of Mark alone this citation or this reference to this young boy who escapes from the Garden of Gethsemane where the betrayal took place, and he's grabbed and then he runs away without his tunic, and some have speculated that was Mark himself, the young lad who happened to witness this, and that's the only reason he put it in there, because that's his little signature there. That's an autobiographical kind of comment. Do you have any thought about that? You know what I'm talking about, right?
I think that's probably the case, because he's the only the only time we see this young man fleeing naked from the scene is in Mark, and it's just this kind of weird detail. Like, why would you include that?
Yeah.
And I think it actually points to the humility of the gospel authors. They include, and I think this again points to the authenticity of the historical narratives, they include things that are embarrassing. These aren't the suave, brilliant men. These are kind of the bumbling guys who never seem to
get it right.
understand what Jesus is doing. Yeah, getting it right. And the focus, if Peter worked closely with Mark on this, who's the biggest one messing up over and over in this final week? It's Peter, who's putting his foot in his mouth, who's hiding, who's afraid of a young servant girl. I think again that's points to authorial authenticity and humility. Yeah, and another one that again I think as modern readers we're so used to the story we sort of bypass this, the fact that it was women who discovered the tomb empty first. They're the first line of defense. They're the first witnesses. They're the ones coming back and telling the rest of the disciples who are kind of in hiding and praying. And we bypass the rabbinical attitudes towards women as witnesses. There's a second century critic of Christianity who's looking back on those stories, and he just was utterly mocking Mary Magdalene. And said that this is a hysterical female deluded by sorcery. Josephus said you couldn't take women's testimony and it wouldn't be accepted by any Jewish court because of the levity and boldness of their sex. So if any of this was, a carefully devised myth, the last people that you would want would be women as the first people. But it's included in there, even though it may have been a bit embarrassing for a first century Jewish male to admit we weren't the first ones to see it, and we're relying upon this testimony from women.
It strikes me, though, as kind of oddly contemporary because you have these brilliant women and a bunch of idiot men.
Exactly.
Which is kind of like every sitcom running right now, and commercials, too. I noticed it a lot. We don't watch TV at our home, but we did DVR the Olympics as a special event, and then we would catch a few of the commercials, so we usually zip through them. And it's the same thing there. The guys are all idiots, So anyway, that's another issue. One other thought that I had about the four accounts, I think a lot of people, they think of the Bible as a book. But it wasn't until the 3rd or 4th century that, as far as we could tell, it really showed up as one book. These are really four independent accounts that are circulating about the person of Jesus. These are four separate and independent testimonies to the life of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. We call them the synoptics of, putting John sort of to one side because he writes, 30 years later. The other one's probably written in 50 or 60, and there's some sort of relationship that scholars debate between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But you're right. I mean, there's so much that we just take for granted that we have all four Gospels, and we can read through them, consecutively, or we can compare and contrast. It wasn't like your average guy in 70 AD had all of copies of these scrolls. It may be that one church had one copy, and that's how they would hear it. And as they go later and discover other accounts, they would find that they're being reinforced, and they're ultimately complementary accounts that select and highlight different aspects of the story, but at the end of the day, it is one story because it's one historical reality viewed through four different lenses.
Yeah, right. Good, well put. Let's get into the narrative then, the week, and we'll just kind of touch on a couple of things here. I want to spend more time on regarding Friday, but what stands out for you about Palm Sunday here in this narrative?
Yeah, it's one of the most interesting events in the life of Jesus because, if you were just to view it as a bystander, here's this guy who looks like just an average first century Jew, nothing to write home about, had no special appearance, and here he comes riding on a donkey into the city of Jerusalem, kind of recapitulating what Solomon did as he came into the temple. Here's the king sort of having a coronation. And one thing that stands out is you have the crowd acclaiming him, shouting Hosanna to him, laying down their palm branches and laying down their courts and their coats, and sort of making a royal red carpet into the city of Jerusalem. And it's always kind of disconcerting as you hear Jesus acclaim so highly, knowing that the crowds are going to turn against him.
The fickle mob.
Right. Now, there may be two different crowds that we're talking about here. In Jerusalem may be more the Jerusalemites, and outside may be more the disciples and the peasants. But it's such a contrast to think of Jesus coming into the city, being acclaimed as the Messiah, the Son of David. But still, even those acclamations are based fundamentally on a misunderstanding. They're excited that the king is coming, the Messiah is here, but they're expecting a physical overthrow now of the temple or of the political order. And Jesus is just continually confounding expectations. So starting on Palm Sunday, all the way through virtually every action of the week, he just doesn't follow the script, and his actions continue to escalate this towards really the point of no return.
I'm curious if you have an opinion on this, and if you don't, that's okay too, but there's some unusual wording in the way Jesus speaks regarding that particular day, and he mourns over Jerusalem and says, if you'd only recognized this day of your visitation, and some have speculated that this is the very day that is the final count and the numbering from the Daniel 9 prophecy. Do you think there's any merit to that?
There might be, but I'll have to confess that Daniel 9 has always confused me, and I think
the 70 weeks.
In the eschaton, I might get that one figured out, but it sort of always goes to the back burner for me.
That's the safe answer, like the prophet who said when God asked him a question, and he said, "Lord, you know." Okay, so I got it. What about the first week? I should say the last week, but here you've got Palm Sunday. Then you have 3 or 4 days where different things are happening until the Last Supper, which is on Thursday evening. So you have preparations there, but you have some controversy going on there. Can you sum up those couple of days here, or just with some things that you think are most relevant in terms of the flow of activity?
Sure.
Up to the final to the Last Supper.
Right. It really starts with Jesus is in Bethany, staying with Lazarus and his sisters. It's just a couple miles east of Jerusalem. That's where he's staying, and he sort of goes back and forth between the city of Jerusalem and Bethany. One of the strangest parts of those early days, and we tend to actually forget about it, I think, because we so front load all of our attention onto those last couple of days. But we have the cursing of the fig tree,
right,
which is just it's enigmatic. What's Jesus doing? Is he just kind of having a bad day, and he, like when your boss yells at you at work and you go home and you kick your dog?
Yeah, right.
Is Jesus having a bad day and he sort of figuratively kicks the fig tree, or what's going on there? But it's one of those things that's overlooked, but as we read it, and we hope that our book is helpful in that, in helping us sort of slow down and look more carefully at what Jesus is doing. It's sort of a physical parable for the disciples and for anybody else who's looking on, that this fig tree, which in the Old Testament represents Israel, is flourishing, but then it's dried up and it's no longer bearing fruit. It's no longer alive. It's no longer fulfilling the purpose that it was designed for. And so it will get turned away. It will get cursed. It's the grace, as it were, has left, and Jesus is moving on. And so even those little things that seem like strange actions by Jesus are actually filled with a lot of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then he goes in and he interacts with the Jewish leaders, and he's operating on the Temple Mount. He's engaging in controversy as they're trying to trap him, trying to pin him down.
Cleanses the temple.
He cleanses the temple.
Do you take this as a second cleansing, the first one being early on in his ministry, and so he kind of bookends his ministry with cleansing? Is that the way you explain those two characterizations, right?
Yeah, and in Dr. Kostenberger's commentary on John, he goes into that in a little bit more detail. Not necessarily a hill to die on, but there's these different things where you're trying to reconcile how do these all fit together when Scripture doesn't lay them out necessarily like our book did in chronological order. So, we think that's a second cleansing. But, Jesus, he's not making it any easier for himself. As he enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, as we say in the book, it's sort of up to that point in his ministry, maybe he could have lived a long life. Maybe he could have gotten away with just his teaching. But everything that he's doing at this point is escalating things further. So,
well, it looks like an act of sedition then at that point, right? Or at least can be called that, because this is the king moving now against Caesar, or at least can be characterized like that.
Right. Yep. From early on in the gospel, he's had his face set to Jerusalem. He knows that this is going to be his final week. And, with the temple cleansing, he's not just doing something to get a rise out of people, but he's consumed with passion for his Father's house, which is being used for ungodly purposes. And, he's not out of control there. He's not throwing a temper tantrum, but this is righteous zeal as he's operating for the glory of God, and the result is the Jewish leaders know that the days are now numbered. This is not just weeks we're talking about. This is a matter of days where we have to put him down.
Well, they've been plotting for quite a while, even from, I think, the beginning of Luke, when he's at the synagogue there in Capernaum, or and people were mad at them, and then you see it more clearly in John 11 after the raising of Lazarus, John 12. And so this is just all coming to a head now, I guess.
And they finally are able to get Judas Iscariot as sort of a willing accomplice who can, be eyes inside the enemy camp and can cooperate with them. And, Satan makes his move. So there's a number of chess pieces moving here. As there's a satanic element, there's the Judas plot, and then there's the religious leaders who, as you mentioned, they've been wanting for a long time now to trap Jesus into. Obviously, they're not finding much success by trapping him verbally or intellectually. They've got to move on to more drastic measures.
Well, this brings us, and I'm looking at the clock, it's ticking away. We actually skipped our second break just because I wanted to keep going with you. It's fascinating for me, JT. I want to talk about briefly, the upper room discourse. Now, that's John 13 through John 17. That's a lot of stuff, and that's just John, and you got more from the others. So there is so much going on up there. Up in the upper room, in that whole thing. To be honest, some of it actually befuddles me. There's a lot I don't even understand about the details there. How would you characterize the point generally, if you can, of the upper room discourse? Is this like a long farewell?
Right. Yeah. It's really amazing when you stop and think about it, because the pace of those final days, seems like the whole gospel we've been leading up to these last few days of Jesus' life, and then things start to happen quickly. But then the narrative sort of slows down with these long, relatively long speeches and teachings from Jesus, and he's helping them. He's essentially giving them his final words. We think of his final words as the final 7 sayings as he's hanging from the cross. Obviously, those are crucial. But this is his final words when he's not under duress, when there's still a little bit of time where he can teach them and go into some detail. And I think if we are able to read through that, we may not get every detail, but if we sort of pull out the key things, the flashing marquee sign here that Jesus is bringing us up into the fellowship of the Trinity. He's got just literally hours to live, and he's talking about his relationship to the Father and the coming of the Spirit and the bond of love between them, and the necessity of love for his disciples, that they would love God with all of their hearts, and that they would love themselves, each other, by having true unity, that the unity that is reflected in the Trinity would be reciprocated in their own lives and their own fellowship, and the importance of prayer and communing with God by the Spirit. All those sort of things. I think as we read through it, thinking these are Jesus's last words before he's going to get arrested, his last time to teach them. If you had sort of, think, Greg, if with your ministry, if you had one more radio program to go, or 24 hours, what would you want to leave with your listeners? It's essentially what Jesus is doing here, saying, this is what I want to leave with you. This is so crucial. And so we can't get into detailed commentary in the book, but we sort of try to highlight some of the key things that Jesus is doing for his disciples in that upper room discourse.
Now we have come to the betrayal in the garden, and I think the Passion of the Christ. This is kind of where this movie starts, and I think of just the image there of Jesus praying by himself in the garden is such it's just a magnificent image. It's Aramaic, in the way this film is done, but it's the Mel Gibson film. But I just that more than anything, the picture there, in the fog and the gnarly trees, and then Jesus just going to his knees in anguish in this prayer communicates so much. Of course, we read the narrative there, but and how he's so gentle with his disciples. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So he's not mad at them, and though he might be, I'd be mad. Let me ask you about Pontius Pilate. Gee, look at it at the time here. Maybe we'll jump back to the trial. Let's talk about the trial for a minute. What stands out for you about the trial?
Well, I think one thing in working through the book that stood out for me is just we tend to think about the trial singular, or maybe a Jewish trial and then this Roman trial. But when you start to break it down, you see Jesus goes from the Garden of Gethsemane to the high priest, and everything's very hastily arranged. Some of it has to do with the fact that Passover is upon them, the Sabbath is coming, so what they're going to do, they have to do quickly, to quote Jesus. So it's very hastily arranged. We're probably at this point early Friday morning, maybe after midnight, 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And it's hastily arranged, and they're trying to pin this on Jesus. And as soon as the sort of informal Jewish trial happens, they need to get him over to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate sort of wants to punt it off to Herod, and he goes over to Herod, and that's sort of a little meaningless exercise there as Herod sends him back. So, one of the things that we tried to do is to take a map of Jerusalem with the lines drawn of the Temple Mount and where all of these things would have taken place, and just shown the path that Jesus would have walked from the Garden of Gethsemane to the palace of the high priest. Where we've got a long footnote in there. We think we know where that palace is, the high priest, and then over to Pilate, and then over to Herod. I mean, it's a sort of a bizarre circumstance where Jesus is just being led all around Jerusalem and
pushed and shoved and abused in the process.
And mocked and treated unjustly. So none of it is actually the best way for a trial to go forward, but the Jews in particular have already determined their conclusion and are just trying to get to that point where Pontius Pilate really does seem more ambivalent and not sure how to handle all
Yeah,
this.
let me ask you about him because he's characterized as this. You see every movie, and he's just this usually this totally callous um, guy, and I washing his hands, okay, and I think he gets a raw deal in depictions of him because he strikes me as a very conflicted man.
Hmm.
And it's not the picture you paint; it's what the picture you see when the details are recounted from the text as you recount them. And he's had two visits or maybe three or something where Jesus is before him, and he seems to be sympathetic to Jesus, but he's caught politically here between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, that's right.
And his wife isn't helping him at all, with
Right.
her dreams and whatever.
Yeah, so he's got the situation with his wife. He's got the situation with wanting to protect the Holy Roman Empire, and he also needs to keep stability in Jerusalem. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. He lives about 70 miles away. He's just in town over Passover, where he's staying in Herod the Great's old palace. So his headquarters now in Jerusalem is where Herod the Great, 30 plus years earlier, was plotting to try to kill Jesus. But this isn't Pilate's hometown. He's just in town, make sure nothing goes wrong, to oversee things, to keep things stable. But you mentioned earlier, Greg, the amount of dialogue. We tend to think that maybe they exchanged a few words here and there. But one of the things about our book is that when you get to that point, you can see everything that they said from all four Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your intuition about him being a conflicted person that we perhaps could be a little bit more sympathetic to is reinforced in contrast to Herod. I mean, Herod has no time for Jesus. He really could care less.
He wants to see a miracle, and that's it.
Right. With Pilate, there's actually meaningful dialogue going back and forth. He really is confused about why this man standing in front of him is not trying to save his own life.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have a category for somebody who is claiming to be a Messiah, claiming to be a king, but doesn't want to physically overthrow him.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who seems sane from all accounts.
And innocent.
But yet seems willing to die.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole thing is throwing him for a loop, and he really doesn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And the most poignant question, of course, is when he looks Jesus in the eye and says, "What is truth?"
Mm-hmm.
And to think he's looking at truth himself, and he doesn't know the answer. He's staring truth literally in the face,
right.
And he doesn't know where to go.
Yeah. Very, very powerful scene, and as I work through the material in your book, being able to follow that conversation and the bewilderment on a couple of levels that Pilate demonstrated, and the coolness in a certain sense of Jesus in complete command, of everything, but knowing everything that is ahead of him.
Right.
It's very touching. We just have a couple, 1 minute here. We could talk about the resurrection. We could, I got so many questions still laying in front of me. When all is said and done, maybe this is a good place to end here. What's the most important question? What's the most important takeaway from the final days of the most important person who ever lived?
Well, we end the book, Greg, with a short little postscript just called, "And who do you say that he is?" Mm-hmm. Because a book like this, we hope that people are helped by it. We hope they learn stuff. We hope it clarifies things for them. But if it's merely about, getting fresh facts in our head, or even getting boned up on apologetics or history, at the end of the day, the question still remains: who do we say that Jesus is? Yeah. This is not just an interesting historical tale, but it confronts us, as it did Pontius Pilate, as we look at Jesus in these four gospel accounts. Are we going to believe that he is who he said he was? And all of history, all of life hinges upon our response to that, because we're looking at Jesus. We have to decide: is this man a fraud? Was he lying? Are these unreliable accounts? Because if he really did what the Gospels say he did, if he really did die for sinners and make a way to God and tear that temple barrier, the temple curtain in two.
That changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, that means the whole world. So it's the most important question we can ever ask. And if the Lord would be pleased to use this little book to help people face that question square on, we would be very grateful.
Well, Justin Taylor, The Final Days of Jesus, the most important week of the most important person who ever lived, published by Crossway, of course. Thanks so much for your time. It's great talking to you again.
Great to talk to you, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Be sure to catch his blog, the Gospel Coalition, called Between Two Worlds. It's just great, rich stuff. Well, that's it for us, friends. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm Greg Koukl for Stand to Reason, Give 'em Heaven this week. All right? Bye-bye now.